Hello, everyone. Welcome back. A few months ago, I asked everyone in my community if they would be willing to participate in a study that I was doing for my clinical psychology graduate program. I actually just finished up my first year of that program, and I've also finished and presented that study. So today, I wanted to run through that study with you, present you the results that I got, and tell you a little bit of the process of what it was like to work on a fully independent research project. Of course, I had a mentor, but all of the data collection and analysis, things of that nature, were done by me. Let's get into it. So, my primary research interest is the intersection of personality and psychopathology. So, essentially, how can our understanding of personality traits, and models influence our understanding of mental illness, their causes, outcomes, things of this nature? So, when I was trying to think of a study that would be feasible given my current level of education and licensure, which is none, I can't do clinical practice at the moment, I decided that a study on personality and risk taking would be a good start. So, my study is looking at the relationship between openness to experience, conscientiousness, which are two personality traits in the five factor model, as well as risk taking through risk taking domains. And I'll go a little bit into detail about what the risk taking domains are. The first thing you typically do when you're deciding on a new study is to do a literature review. What that means is you're going to be looking at previous research and studies that have studied similar things to what you are planning to study. Maybe they've even studied the exact same thing and you just want to do it in a slightly different way. Now, personality and risk taking is not a novel or a new idea, and that's actually one of the reasons I chose it because I wanted to do something that would be feasible given my level of education and experience. So I wanted to do something that might be able to add a little bit to the literature without being overly complex. Now, there has been quite a bit of research examining how personality and risk taking present in the past. For example, we know that extroversion and openness to experience are generally positively associated with risk taking, while conscientiousness, the personality trait associated with being organized, orderly, dutiful, is negatively associated with risk taking, essentially meaning that if you're higher in conscientiousness, you're less likely to take risks. And if you're higher in openness to experience or extroversion, you're more likely to take risks. Now, these relationships and the strengths of those relationships vary depending on which measurement you're using for either the five factor model and risk taking. I specifically chose a measure called the DOSPERT, which is a measure of risk taking that divides risk taking into different domains or styles of risk taking, so that after I finished my primary analysis, I could do what's called exploratory analysis, and I could see if there was any specific relationships between the two personality traits that I'm measuring, openness and conscientiousness, and the domains of risk taking. But my primary hypothesis, the thing that I'm primarily testing for, or was primarily testing for in this study, was a moderation analysis. Let me explain that to you because you might not be familiar with moderation analysis. So essentially, let's say we have a correlation. We have a relationship between two things. We have, let's say, for example, openness to experience and risk taking. Openness to experience and risk taking have a correlation with each other. So it's not causal. Openness to experience doesn't cause risk taking, but there's like a 0.2 to 0.3, depending on the study relationship between these two variables, suggesting that if you are higher in openness to experience, you're more likely to have a higher propensity towards risk taking. So then, what does a moderation mean in statistics? Well, a moderation is when you kind of add a third variable that influences the relationship between these two things. So if we have openness to experience and risk taking, what would it look like if conscientiousness was also coming into factor here? Like if we added it as a third variable that is directly between these two variables, what would that do to the relationship between these two things? So the hypothesis that I formed based on my review of the prior literature was that as someone got higher in conscientiousness, that their relationship between openness to experience and risk taking would lower. And I thought that maybe it would kind of flatten or even out because the relationship that is positive between openness and risk taking is about 0.2 to 0.3. And the relationship that is negative between conscientiousness and risk taking is about 0.2 to 0.3. So I figured if you had someone who was relatively open and was also similarly relatively conscientious, that would kind of cancel each other out, and then they would be essentially not more or less likely to be someone who is a risk taker. So I started collecting data. I was using a few different measurements. For the five-factor model, openness and conscientiousness, I was using those subscales from the Big Five inventory, which is a reputable and known measure of the five-factor model personality traits. For risk-taking, as I mentioned earlier, I was using the DOSPERT. So let's break down the DOSPERT really quickly. So the DOSPERT breaks risk-taking down into different variables. These are going to be ethical risk-taking, financial risk-taking, health and safety risk-taking, recreational risk-taking, and social risk-taking. These are pretty much in line with what you would think when you see them. Ethical, you keep money if you knew it had been stolen from your workplace. Financial would be, are you willing to gamble or bet? Health and safety, would you drive without a seatbelt on? Recreational, would you do something like bungee jump or whitewater rafting? And social, would you disagree with an authority figure on a major issue? Now, for my analysis, I did something kind of unique, and I think this influenced the results that I got, and it may be why the results weren't what I expected. I summed the scores of the different DOSPERT domains to create a general risk-taking factor. So while this measure is typically used to measure different risk-taking domains, I figured if we had all these different domains, if we kind of just summed them up, it would create a general propensity towards risk-taking. And this is something that has been done in other studies, but isn't a traditional use of this method. And it's something that I've learned probably won't be something I'll do for any future studies, because I think that the risk-taking domains function better as individual domains and you learn more. And that's something that I learned from the analysis and the exploratory analysis, which we'll get into in just a second. So the final data set included 110 people. I actually had to throw out over 40 surveys of people who failed the attention check. An attention check in research is when you ask someone to essentially answer a question a certain way. I think a few people misinterpreted this as maybe part of the risk-taking assessment and answered wrong on purpose. At least that's what I think. But I had to throw away over 40 results because that is unfortunately something that you have to decide before you start collecting data. So when I submitted the ethics proposal for this and how I was going to analyze it, I had to say, well, if they were going to fail this attention check, I have to throw out that data. So unfortunately, if you failed the attention check, your data was not included in this. But 110 is still a good sample size. I actually did what's called a power analysis beforehand, and a power analysis is when you essentially determine how many people you would need to get semi-accurate results from your study. And it was only like, I think 77 or 76. Either way, I met what was needed for the power analysis. So let's get into the results. So my primary hypothesis was that conscientiousness would moderate the relationship between openness to experience and risk-taking. And this primary hypothesis was not supported, essentially meaning that there is no interacting effect between openness to experience and conscientiousness towards risk-taking. But interestingly enough, the expected relationships between openness and risk-taking and conscientiousness and risk-taking were also not significant, essentially meaning that there was no relationship between these these two variables, I guess you could say, towards risk-taking at all, whether it's individually or interacting. And this was something that surprised me. And I think, and I'm actually pretty sure, this is because I used a general risk factor for this primary analysis instead of using the individual domains, which is why after this hypothesis was not supported and the suspected relationships between the two variables and risk-taking were also not shown, that I went on to do the exploratory analysis, investigating the relationship between openness, conscientiousness, and the individual domains of risk-taking. So did I find anything useful from the exploratory analysis? Well, yes. In fact, when looking over my data was actually quite good. The skew and kurtosis, the distribution, all of that was pretty normal for what we would expect with the variables that I had. And this suggests that my data was usable, it was good, as well as the fact that I had a good sample size. So the fact that I didn't get that expected relationship really, to me, showed that maybe the general risk-taking factor wasn't a good thing. But when I took it over to the domain level, we started to see some significant relationships. 3 stood out to me, and 3 were significant across the domains. So openness to experience was positively significantly related to social risk-taking. Conscientiousness was also significantly positively associated with social risk-taking. But conscientiousness was also significantly negatively related to ethical risk taking. So let's break that down. So if you're someone who is higher in openness to experience, you are more likely to take social risks. If you're someone who's high in conscientiousness, you're more likely to take social risks and less likely to take ethical risks. What does this essentially mean? It, in my opinion, provides evidence for the idea that risk taking domains should exist as opposed to a general risk taking factor. Because of conscientiousness, a personality trait can be positively associated with one risk taking domain while also simultaneously being negatively associated with another type of risk taking. That provides evidence for the idea that these two risk taking domains are separate constructs that are measuring similar but different things. Knowing what I know about social risk taking and conscientiousness and openness now, I decided to repeat my prior moderation analysis with just social risk taking. So I took openness, social risk taking on the other end. We know there's a correlation between them. And then I added conscientiousness again as a moderating variable to see if openness and conscientiousness would interact to influence risk taking. Essentially, are they combining with each other, canceling each other out, anything of that nature when you have high in both of these traits? Is that influencing risk taking? This was actually not the case. So, social risk taking was not impacted by any sort of interaction between openness and conscientiousness. What does that mean? Because they're both significantly related to social risk taking, but they're not interacting. Well, it means that the way in which people go about social risk taking through these two variables is most likely different, or that's what the evidence suggests, is that it's not going to be that because you're someone who's high in openness and conscientiousness that you're going to essentially double your social risk taking. It doesn't mean that they're additive or multiplicative with each other. It just means that both of these traits individually lead to social risk taking, but in some sort of different way. They were both significantly related, but they didn't cross and interact to create some sort of interaction effect. So that was my first study. As I mentioned earlier, it's nothing too insanely groundbreaking, but it was a good first step for me towards understanding how to gather participants, formulate theories, develop hypotheses, run analysis, these sorts of things. It was a good experience for me, and I think that it did tell us a little bit about the relationship between personality and risk taking. And in the future, I plan to do similar styles of studies, especially with the five-factor model, which I think is really my direction and where I'm going for clinical psychology, because that's the more prominent personality model that we use in clinical. In fact, over the summer, you're probably going to see me conducting another study, and anyone on this channel is welcome to participate in that study as well. And I'll probably be talking a little bit more about that in the near future. But thank you all for watching. This was just a brief insight into a study on personality and risk taking, and I hope you learned something, or this sparked some sort of interesting thought for you. Thanks for watching. What you doing, buddy? Say hi. Who's that? Who's that? Hi.